Could the U.S. accidentally trigger a war with China?
Well, certainly it may not be what we intend, but wars don't start by accident. They're intentional policy decisions. So certainly, if a war were to erupt, it would be because Beijing wanted to start one, not because folks simply made a mistake. Mistakes are things that people don't intend to do. Wars are the most intentional things that humans undertake. I think it's a misnomer to talk about sort of accidental wars.
So if we fly an airplane and that kind of gets near Chinese airspace and they accidentally nix a Chinese jet that has come to intercept or something like that, that wouldn't actually accidentally cause a war. It'd be because China is already wanting to do something.
Well, it could cause an accident.
Right.
And certainly an accident could be very bad, and it could certainly harm or kill individuals that were involved in that particular accident. And it could be used as a pretext to do something that someone had already intended to do. But the idea that that would be the cause, and that neither side wanted a war, but they just accidentally found themselves in a conflict, seems a bit weird. It's just not a concept that seems to match with like how humans operate.
Yeah. I mean, an interesting corollary would be the 1999 bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, where the U.S. Well, the initial U.S. report was, it was a total accident, and it may or may not have been an accident, that bombing of the Chinese military attaché's office, but either way, it didn't actually cause a war between the U.S. and China. It did kill people, and it was something the U.S. did with military weaponry, and yet China didn't want to start a war over it.
Right. And again, it certainly can cause significant tensions and problems in a relationship. It could certainly complicate a whole bunch of things. But the idea that just because an accident happens, that means that essentially a war erupts, seems like an unlikely outcome.
I think when you put it like that, it seems like, oh, well, that makes sense that you'd have to intentionally go to war. But why is this kind of myth of accidental war so pervasive that you had to write, a chapter in a book about it?
Well, I think part of it is that it's, we have some folks who just probably don't think very much about war, right? I mean, it's one of these things where we've kind of gotten away from, and sort of, kind of a misunderstanding of how wars start, how they unfold, what leaders make this, how leaders make decisions about entering into a conflict. I think one of the things that I think is pretty clear to me is that leaders go to war because they think they're going to win. They don't go to war because they think they're going to lose. So it's about optimism, and it's about a vision of success, rather than a fear that the other side is threatening you and that you're forced to do this. That in many cases, when you feel threatened, you find other ways out of this, and you seek negotiation and those sorts of things. It's only when you feel supremely confident that you begin a war of aggression against a neighbor, or against another power. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was not because he thought that NATO was strong and that Ukraine was strong. He thought it was because he thought those places were weak and that they wouldn't respond and they wouldn't be able to fight back. That's the rationale that leaders make when they make those decisions.
So, if that's the case, then the solution to ensuring we don't have war with China would not be to make sure we avoid accidents in airspace or naval space or whatever, but rather to erode Xi Jinping's confidence that he could actually win.
I think that's a good summary of how to do this. This gets us back to the concepts of deterrence, the idea that you need to be able to create in the minds of your rivals that they could not achieve the outcomes they desire through the use of force, and that it forces them to find negotiated methods to come to the solutions that they would like. But when when your rival feels that they can use force to achieve the outcome that they want at a cost that is lower than what the perceived benefit will be, then the likelihood of them starting a conflict goes way up, right? That's the logic that leaders will go through, and I think we've sort of lost sight of that. We've believed that in many ways that it's the United States is the only one with agency here, and therefore, if we provoke others, then that might force them into a conflict, or if we're too prepared, that's what might actually start a war. And I think that's a mistake.
That's almost weirdly self-centered.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think also it's interesting that like a lot of the U.S. policy towards China has, in terms of, it's kind of like trying to make the U.S. seem as unthreatening as possible, like make the U.S. small, like reassure China that, we are not trying to contain you, like all this kind of language where it seems like we're trying to make ourselves less of a threat. And from what you're saying, that might actually be counterproductive.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, my old boss, General H.R. Master, used to talk about, a concept about strategic narcissism, this self-centered look at your own actions and an inability to see that others have agency and they make their own decisions along their own logic and their own rationality of how they understand the world and make their own assessments. And when you get stuck into the mindset that essentially we in Washington are the ones that are driving all decisions, and that if we choose not to do something, like we choose not to enter into a Cold War, well, then there is no Cold War, right? As if others don't have the authority or the agency to make their own decisions and take their own actions. And that, I think, is a really dangerous situation because it leads us down a path of overconfidence in our own capabilities to shape the world, as opposed to being very realistic that others have real capabilities as well.
Now, you used to work for the U.S. National Security Council, and just this week we're seeing U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Beijing talking with Xi Jinping, and I know they've got a bunch of things to talk about, but one of the things presumably they're talking about is how to increase communications to avoid war, perhaps, at least from Sullivan's perspective. Is that going to increase Xi Jinping's optimism about whether he can take Taiwan, or is it going to prevent a war like that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't, on the face of it, I do not object to the idea that we continue to maintain contact with the second largest economy in the world, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, right? These are all things we should be doing. We should have normal contact. My concern is that we have sort of communicated, or we have implied that we are far more interested in maintaining stability and finding off ramps and managing the competition and allowing our rival to then control the pace of it and feel quite confident that any action they take will not result in an escalation, because we will seek to slow it down and we will seek to find an off ramp. And that's a sort of a bad position to be in, because it emboldens the confidence of your rival to feel that they have the initiative and they can take chances and act in risky ways. So that's I think a challenge there. I suspect that some of the other topics that the National Security Advisor is raising are things around China's obvious and material support for Russia in its war in Ukraine, its threats against Taiwan, its threats against its other neighbors, the Philippines and Japan. We just had this week, the violation of Japanese territorial airspace, presumably for the first time. I mean, at least that's what the Japanese are reporting. And that happened, in the hours before Jake Sullivan arrived in Beijing. So it's disturbing that we continue to sort of do these and create those impressions. And I think those impressions embolden Beijing to do more against us, rather than reassuring them. They're reassured that we're going to back down.
And you said that this is not a good position for the U.S. to be in. What would be the best position for the U.S. to be in? And I guess, how can the U.S. get there?
Well, we made a couple of decisions about a decade ago around sequestration, around our own defense planning, in which we have essentially bottomed out sort of our defense spending as a proportion of GDP. And we constrained the way in which we sort of defined the way in which we would do defense planning around one major war, and that's the only thing we would plan for. Maybe in 2013, that was an acceptable conclusion to make about a relatively benign international environment. But we don't live in a benign international environment anymore. We have a defense spending as a proportion of GDP that is on the same level as we were at in the late 1990s. Sort of historic lows for the United States. In fact, of all the NATO countries over the last 2 years, there's only 4 countries that have reduced their defense spending as a proportion of GDP: Croatia, Italy, Greece, and the United States. So, as the rivalry and competition increases with Beijing, we have sent a message that we are not actually preparing ourselves for a potential conflict, which I think communicates to Beijing that they have an opportunity to do more aggressive things and that we won't be able to respond. And of course, that has to do with the multiple ongoing other conflicts that draw our attention away and our resources away. That's just the way the world is. It'd be great to be able to sort of ignore parts of the world, but fundamentally, we're going to probably have to recalibrate our spending to be able to match the threats that are out there.